Welcome back to the Core Online Learning channel. We will be looking at more poetry comparisons today, and the poems that we are going to focus on are Exposure and Storm on the Island. Do not forget to like and subscribe and watch the other videos in the playlist as well if you are studying for your Power and Conflict poetry exam. So, when we are looking at Exposure and Storm on the Island, we are focused on their similarities, the conflict between humans and nature, the power of nature, and nature as harmful. Now, there is an actual conflict going on in Exposure, which is World War I. However, the conflict that we're talking about is not necessarily war, as in humans at war. It's actually humans feeling like they are at war with their surroundings and with nature. So if the question is about war specifically, then you might choose to compare Exposure to something like Bayonet Charge or War Photographer or Remains. You do not have to compare it to Storm on the Island, but if the question is about the power of nature, then it is really good to be able to compare Exposure to Storm on the Island, or even The Prelude as well, because they both show the power of nature and nature as more powerful than man. That is what's shown in Exposure and Storm on the Island. Nature is far more powerful than man, and that is why they feel like they are at war with it, and they feel like they are fighting nature in both Exposure and Storm on the Island. The power of nature is clear because nature is presented as more powerful than humans in both poems, and nature is also presented as quite harmful to the speakers in both poems as well. Now, we know Exposure was written as a sort of biographical account from Owen because these events did really happen to him. He was told that he must lay on the cold ground, and there were people around him who had passed away from these sort of terrible conditions in the war and these cold conditions as well. So when he writes this, he is writing as though he really is at war and as though his life is at risk because of that context. So we really get that idea that he is struggling to survive throughout the entire poem. In Storm on the Island, it seems a bit less pressing. They're not necessarily struggling to survive, but they are compromising a lot with nature just to exist. So when we look at that, I'm going to discuss Exposure on one side and then Storm on the Island on the other. We are going to look first of all at Storm on the Island when he says we build our houses squat. So that shows the compromise between nature that I was just talking about, between nature and man. So they are building their houses squat because that is better for the weather conditions that they live in. They are shorter and wider to be more stable in the weather. So although there's no necessarily imminent threat of death, they are still having to live their lives in a different way because of nature and because of the power of it. And they do feel attacked in some ways. So we can see, again, we're talking about Storm on the Island on the right, it blows full blast, exploding comfortably, spits like a tame cat turned savage. Now we will zoom in on these, but all of them really show how difficult it is when you are attacked by nature. Now, Owen, on the left, when we talk about Exposure, personifies nature and talks about nature as though it's an enemy directly attacking him and trying to take his life. So Dawn massing in the east her melancholy army makes Dawn sound like the commander of a great army, makes it sound as though the day has come to attack them. And there are moments in the poem where there's just this tragedy of him not understanding whether he's alive or dead, and he says, "Is it that we are dying?" right at the end of one of his stanzas to really show that confusion. He isn't aware, or he can't pinpoint exactly if he's alive or dead because there's just so much suffering going on. So he is directly attacked by the weather itself, and there's also more personification when he says the merciless iced east winds that knife us. Now we've got the adjective merciless in there, and we can zoom in on the adjective merciless as well, because what he's saying here is that they are shown no mercy. They are given no consideration by nature. Nature just attacks and attacks and attacks, and it does not care that it is harming them so terribly. Now we link that back to Storm on the Island. It blows full blast, exploding comfortably. These are all words to do with war. So these are all word choices that link together the fact that in Storm on the Island he feels as though he is at war with nature. And that forms what we might call a semantic field, which is where all of our words sort of link together under one sort of umbrella. And the umbrella is war, and we see words like blast and exploding, and I'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. But this really shows that, again, they also feel attacked by nature. Perhaps because of the context, we might see it as less serious than Owen, but they still feel that way. They still feel in danger because of the weather. And then we've got that lovely simile, spits like a tame cat turned savage, which is really interesting because when you tame a cat, you expect it to be loyal to you and not to do anything that you would consider savage or more wild. But actually what it's showing is, at the end of the day, these are wild animals and they cannot truly ever be tamed, the same way you can try to coexist with nature, but actually nature is always going to be a bit of a threat. You know, there's always the threat of an earthquake or a tsunami or a volcano in places across the world. There's always a threat of a big, huge thunderstorm that, you know, causes ridiculous amounts of damage. There's nothing we can do to really tame nature. And I'll link that into conflict as well, because we can link in the other two quotations that I said from exposure, but we could also link in the fact that he's dazed and he's dozed, and the use of those word choices, which really shows that he's incredibly disoriented. He's not really sure what's going on. The conflict with nature has caused him to feel very out of it and be unable to function, really. And then we've got, again, our words that are to do with that semantic field of war. And we've got exploding, blast, and salvo. So those are three words that you can just remember. Now, when it comes to both poems and when it comes to our understanding of both poems, we want to talk about the fact that they both feel as though they are being attacked by the nature around them. There are lots of other points that you can talk about, and again, you can talk about the differences in their context, but you can also talk about the fact that actually there was and there have been real deaths when it comes to nature. So your context doesn't have to be a long old history lesson in your essay, but your points can link really well to the fact that actually both poems respond to people who suffer and die at the hands of nature. In World War I, it was a massive reality for men to die of exposure. So even the title itself can be zoomed in on. When you die of exposure, it means you died of exposure to the elements, which means you have died of nature, really. So you've been too exposed to it. And in Storm on the Island, we see that they feel very much like they are in danger. And actually, storms cause danger for everyone across the world. When there's a particularly big storm, it can destroy property, it can bring down power lines. You know, it's a very real possibility that someone could be harmed by nature in both poems. And in Exposure, we know those poor conditions in World War I caused a lot of damage to these men. Owen even wrote home to his mother about it to talk about how horrendous he found it. Now, another point in Exposure, and this is more of a structural point, is that a lot of stanzas end with statements and rhetorical questions where he's questioning what's going on. And one of the questions that I mentioned earlier when he says, "Is it that we are dying?" shows that nature has mentally attacked him as well. Not just physically, but mentally, he doesn't know what's going to happen next. And we link that to Dawn massing in the east, her melancholy army. Nature is almost attacking him the way an enemy would, and it sort of proves that idea that he feels that nature can't necessarily be stopped, and that nature will continue to attack him until he does die, because at this point he's not even sure what's really going on. It's quite a tragic moment really there. So remember, if the question is about war, please make sure that you compare exposure to a war poem, because it will make it a lot easier for you. But if the question is about any kind of conflict, then you can easily argue that exposure is about conflict with nature, as is Storm on the Island, and you can link them together pretty successfully if you use the points from this video or any other points that you think are valid. Please remember to like and subscribe and watch the rest of the series as well.